I'm Mr. Sinolit. Welcome to Sinolit, and we're very glad here today to have Dr. Marilyn Bowman here, a professor in psychology who embarked on a huge research project documenting the life of James Legge, and this resulted in the book that I have reviewed as being stories within stories, wrapped up in stories, covers a mammoth number of topics in order to help the reader comprehend the significance of Legge's own wide-ranging studies. Hello and welcome, Dr. Bowman. What first drew you to James?
I came upon him completely by accident. I was researching the origins of mental ability testing in all of human history, and of course I just discovered the Chinese examination system. But I was trying to find an exact date or a reasonably exact date, and I went to many books of Chinese history, and finally I found myself in the library. And I was in a James Legge book reading one of the long introductory essays, which sort of tried to test this date or that date and so forth. And I saw these big, fat 5 books, and I thought, how come? I've been a mad reader my entire life. I've never heard of James Legge. So I started just getting curious. I finished the article and it got published, but I thought, I'm just going to go online and see what I can find out. And the more I went, the more interested I got. And finally, I just became obsessed.
That sounds very familiar to me. Very familiar. Ringing some bells here. I mean, the man was a missionary, an educator, and a titan in the area of translation. That's how I found him. I first found him in every single work of Chinese philosophy. His name on the inside page, on almost every single one, and that got me thinking, how many of these so-called modern translators are really just working off of James Legge's work and just saying they know Chinese? So many of them do that, and it was his translations that really impressed me and still stand up to this day.
Well, there have been many modern translators, and I'm not an expert in Chinese language, but I've spoken to people who are much more expert than I, and they tell me about some of the other modern translators try to add some sort of modern tint to the translation, whereas Legge stuck very carefully to the idea and thinking of that time. And so, they say his work is still the gold standard, even though his language is a bit stately, a bit Victorian, but it's truer to the concepts.
Well, I would say that the stately language is a strength, Marilyn. I think they suit the Confucian translations he did, because Confucius himself was a stately and refined man. So I think they very much hold up, and they're very accurate. And
well, I was impressed. For every page of translation, there's this little collection of footnotes at the bottom explaining how he dealt with this issue or that issue and what possibilities there might be. He was so meticulous as a scholar.
It's absolutely amazing. And I'm yet to even read those. I'd really love to be able to read those commentaries one day. I have access to these, and I've seen they're online in big, huge volumes. I think maybe that's something for me to read at one point in the future.
I eventually bought the 5 volumes.
Oh, did you? I heard about that.
The 5 volumes. And I haven't read them all through. I was reading all about him all the time, and I've read all the introductory essays, which are wonderfully interesting to read. But it's part of my retirement life. I'm going to treat myself to going through. I've been taking Chinese lessons on Duolingo. I'm now on day 1,506.
Well done. That's the determination that James Legge himself would be. I'm sure he does that. He did that, didn't he? Yeah.
I mean, my friends think I'm all crazy because I've been to China quite a few times, but I don't plan any further trips. I'm just fascinated, and I don't want to keep my brain working. And it's such a rich culture.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I'm sure we'll get into a bit later. I thought let's get to know the man a little bit better.
Yeah.
So there's him as a younger man,
Probably, what would you say, in the cover of your book, that looks like he would be in his 30s, would you say, in that picture?
Younger than that. It's somewhere in the book when that picture was made, but I can't remember the date.
So I do like that portrait.
I do too. You know, it shows that sort of rough Scottish country boy, but intellectual.
Mutton chops as well.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. So born in 1815 in Huntly.
He seemed to have a talent from a young age in translation, the Latin. I wondered, Marilyn, who do you think was an influential person in James Legge's life at this age in Huntly?
It's not clear to me, because I think his family was sort of surprised by his intense scholarly skills and interests and so forth. It didn't seem that they were giving him a lot of support or a lot of discouragement. His original mother died, and it took a few years before he learned that this mother was his stepmother now. And but I think Scotland was just in a stage of really believing in the value of education so much, and he just was able to gobble it up. He just relished learning new things.
That came across to me. I think his stoic father Ebenezer seemed to have an influence him. He seemed to be a steady person, always there. It struck me about the missionary William Milne as well, giving him letters as a youth in Chinese. And I remember reading your passage and it saying he was fascinated by the characters on the yellowed paper. And that struck me as that perhaps was the link. What do you think?
Yeah, probably you're right. I mean, when he became a teenager, his father, I guess, was owned some properties out in the countryside, and he sent young James out to collect some of the rents. And James was not interested in that at all. He was not interested in business money, not at all. He was interested in these delicate letters that he saw on this yellowed paper.
Yeah, I think that's something perhaps we can relate to, can't we, Marilyn? The lack of business sense, maybe. The sort of just the pure ideal of wanting to know for knowing's sake is something I think really runs through James's life consistently. So this is his early age in Huntly, in his schooling, and I remember he was offered to become an Anglican, not Anglican, perhaps that's the wrong word, Scottish Anglican, Church of Scotland priest, and he turns that down. Why do you think that was, Marilyn?
He was offered what would have been a very plum job and given him an excellent future for his whole life. But he realized he would have to give up some of his principles about congregationalism, which is that each congregation gets to choose how it wants to go about things, including choosing its own minister. And he realized, even though it would be a great job and he would have an academic connection and he could become famous and well, he just didn't want that. He really stuck to his very basic human principle that every man is equal, and
Sure, yeah, he did, absolutely. And I think that's a thread running through his life as well, not just idealistic in words but also in actions as well.
That's right. I mean, what I really loved as I learned more and more about his life was these really strong friendships he formed with some of these Chinese men that he worked with. They really loved him and he really loved them, and that was wonderful.
Hong Rengan and Wang Tao stick out to me. The Hong Rengan, amazingly, the man who was cousin of the Taiping rebellion leader Hong Shouquan, just passed down the opportunity to enter the Church of Scotland, and he enters LMS and applies to become a minister. There's a quote here that struck me from your book. They asked him, why would you want to go to China and why would you want to learn Chinese? And he said he expected that mastering Chinese would give him joy, which the acquisition of wealth and worldly fame could never bestow. So what do you think James Legge was like at this age as a person?
Well, I think you know, the interesting thing is what happened after he finished university, because he wasn't all that sure of what kind of person he would
Hmm.
be or what he would do. And he went down into England and visited his brother, who had a big church that was quite thriving and so forth. And James at that point wasn't even totally sure that he was a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
but he started to realize that he was, and that and this interest in China started to sort of coalesce. And uh, I think his values were just not of the commercial Legge
Hmm.
family business at all. They were just, you know, more core principled Christianity.
Hmm. Yes, that certainly came across to me. Yes, yes. Otherwise,
Yeah.
why would he sacrifice so much and live such a tough life out in the missionary life?
1839, he left for Malacca.
And he just married Mary Isabella Morrison, hadn't he?
That's right. I mean, they were both very young.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They were very brave of them.
Because at that point, expected if you went on as a missionary to China, which nobody knew anything about among the general public, you were gone for life. So he renounced his inheritance.
Left a lock of his hair with
Yeah.
his parents, as if
which
he was going forever.
Which Christopher Legge still has. I've photographed that lock of his hair. He was a blonde.
So in Malacca, I remember one of the major problems he had was getting access to just anyone who would teach him Chinese, and he learnt, unfortunately, he couldn't have known anything else because he didn't have access to the mainland Chinese Mandarin. He learnt as they say, Hokkaian dialect.
Yeah.
That they spoke in Malacca at the time. Imagine having to realize I've just learnt one language and then I'm gonna have to learn 2 or 3 more.
That's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that mission was in a state of great disarray, and so was the mission that eventually was operating in Singapore. There was all kinds of scandalous land deals and various kinds of small-scale corruption, and all he wanted to do was learn the language.
Yeah. I remember the impression to me of that time was a whole lot of turmoil between the different missionaries as well. All the fights over who's responsible for what and what were the intentions, and all the lag between the LMS Central in London, the amount of time it took just to send letters to there to have decisions finalized.
Yeah,
It must have been a nightmare.
it must have been a nightmare. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not surprising that he got sick and his wife got sick. I mean, really, it must have been terrible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I remember one of the quotes from the book was they had to pre-plan to get a goat over with them on one of the boats just for help, for milk for their kids. I mean, just imagine having to plan ahead for that kind of eventuality.
That's right.
It's
when
amazing.
They eventually did go to Hong Kong, they took a goat with them on that ship so that it would have milk for the children on their route to Hong Kong, because that would be a long sailing voyage.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. So he's got to Hong Kong in around, I've got a date, around 1844. Does that sound right?
Actually, 1843. As soon as it became a British entrepot, he moved there.
It was amazing to me. It came across in your book just how tough life as a missionary was. There's some data that you had in your book. The death rate for sick Europeans in Hong Kong was 32%. Absolutely incredible.
It was phenomenal. Modern scholars think it was probably malaria, but like huge numbers of the British garrison there were wiped out. And there was one article I read that sort of looked at missionaries and their wives and their lives and the death rate. It was just phenomenal. I mean, Victorian death rates, even in our countries, were fairly high because all these infectious diseases of children and TB and everything killed off lots of people. But there they had all the tropical infectious diseases in addition.
Yes,
No,
yes. It's amazing how much they gave up in terms of their health, and the sacrifice really impressed me.
yeah.
Mm.
You know, he met, I forget the names of the two brothers that he met originally down in around Malacca, but he met them later in life when they had moved up the Chinese
Mm-hmm.
coast. And one old fellow had lost all his teeth.
Mm.
You know, they were living under really primitive conditions and just making a go of it as best they could.
Yes, they
And
were.
of course,
Mm-hmm.
all the deaths of his children, you know, 6 died prematurely.
Yeah, tragic. Yeah,
Unbelievable
as a
by modern eyes.
yeah, I can't imagine. I'm a dad too, and that must have been really tragic for James Legge. Really tough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just the amount of turmoil he was sort of arriving into, the fact that it was in many ways almost like a wild land of, in many ways, lawlessness and pirates. He faced on many occasions, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah. Shipboard fires. He once rescued
Yeah.
a ship from burning up while he was on the high seas. And they got wrecked in a terrible storm in another trip. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How has a film not been made about James Legge?
I
It's just
know.
it could be a trilogy, couldn't it? It could be it could have elements of Pirates of the Caribbean. It could have elements of 7 Years in Tibet. It could have elements of The Last Emperor. It could have so many things in it.
That's right.
It's amazing, amazing. Yeah. So 1843 gets to Hong Kong, and then soon after that, we have the Taiping Rebellion, and he has some brushes with that. What do you remember about that period in James Legge's life in Hong Kong?
He was initially, the missionaries were kind of sympathetic to it because they thought it was Christian, but I think he had a more sophisticated understanding of it, partly through his protege Hong Rengan. And he realized that the Christianity was a very distorted version of his idea of Christianity, and he tried to keep Hong out of danger, but he was connected with the Taiping king, and he thought he had some responsibilities there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's quite sad, wasn't it? It seems sad to me how they appear to be very close. He describes him as them walking arm in arm and becoming good friends over the work on the translation. And then he went off to the Taiping Rebellion, sort of behind James's back in a way, and against how he would have advised him.
Yeah. It must have been a very sad business for him. And Mary kept getting sick with her pregnancies because I'm sure she had what we now call preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure. So with every pregnancy, she would get terribly sick, and then quite often the new babies would die because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so these horrible family events were just taking place during all this turmoil with the Taiping Rebellion, and still tough relations between Britain and the Chinese imperial government.
What do you think Mary was like?
You know, I didn't get a very clear picture of her. I mostly got a picture of somebody who was sweet and good and compliant, but nothing much more than that. But she must have had some kind of adventurous part to her temperament to agree to marry this man who wanted to go to China. You know, there must have been some adventurousness there, but I really didn't get a strong picture of her at all.
The same. I remember I did get a bit more clearer picture of Hannah.
Yes.
Because I remember, am I right? There were some direct quotations from her diaries while she was in China. Yeah, I remember I had some. Her describing the Pearl River Delta in its, I think she described it as being quite dirty and busy and hectic.
Yes, she went on a trip to what was called Canton then. And of course, it was a crammed Chinese city with incredible ranges of wealth to poverty. And she was quite upset by what she saw on the streets there, because she was a widow of a man who I think had been quite a success when James married her on a trip back to England. So she was used to living in kind of stylish circumstances. And she set up a household in Hong Kong that I think was quite different from what Mary had. You know, they were a couple known in the colony, so they would get invited to a fancy dinner, and Hannah would write back about all the lavish food and the clothes of the women and stuff like that. And there was never a hint of that kind of thing with Mary.
It sounds like she was used to a higher sort of standard of living.
I think so, yeah.
Then after that, they have a few children with Hannah as well, and that's also between periods of moving back and forth at the same time.
Yes.
Does Hannah, at one point, she's in Scotland in Huntly whilst James is in Hong Kong still? Am I right?
Gee, I can't remember that.
Oh, there's so much moving around, isn't there?
I know.
There's just
and there was even a question if they had 5 children or 4 children. I could only find real evidence about 4 children with her, but plus the Marion that she brought with her. But I think Lauren Pfister thinks that there was another one, but I could never find out who that might be.
Yeah. Well, just so much moving around, so many things to keep tabs on, weren't there? In a biography of James Legge, yeah. And all that research you did for all those sources, what sources did you find most helpful for finding out about James Legge in general?
It was SOAS, the archives at SOAS, which have the Council of World Missions archives. In that, year by year by year, all these boxes of handwritten letters. I took thousands of pages of handwritten notes from these handwritten letters, because in those archive libraries, they don't allow you to photograph anything. They don't want to photocopy anything, and they don't want you to use ink in case you make marks on the precious documents. Everything has to be handwritten in pencil. I had stacks of pages. And I eventually gave them all away to another scholar, and I kind of regret it because I love the color of the detail in those letters. So like SOAS is the main source, but for a lot of other letters about the colony itself, and like Hobson, the doctors, and John, that wonderful young scholar who died at age 23.
Are you talking about John Morrison or Robert Morrison? One of the two. There was a father and a son who were both pretty accomplished. Yes.
Yeah. There are a lot of handwritten letters about them at the there's a big medical library, the Wellcome Medical Library in London. It's got a storehouse of archives of handwritten letters from them, all the doctors.
Amazing. Well, it sounds like you've done all the hard work already. I mean, if anyone wants to any of this in more detail, then I'm introducing very briefly here. Read Marilyn's book, because it does. This is an introduction. We're talking about James Legge, and there's so much more you can find out about James in Marilyn's book. So yeah, Marilyn's done all the hard work already.
I also went up to there's a British newspaper library in North London. So I went and got read on those microfiche sheets, all those old newspaper articles in Hong Kong in the 1840s and 1850s, you know, click, 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 all those antiquated machines.
Wow. I mean, I think maybe a lot of viewers for this would never have even come into contact with things like that.
Yeah.
Quite possibly.
And the other great place, although not as rich, but it's a wonderful place, the New York Public Library has a special Asia collection section, and it's got a whole bunch of very old books. And when I started going in there, like I camped out in New York for a few weeks, going there every day. And once the librarians realized I was taking out lots and lots of their collection. They just let me back into the stacks. They said, you just stay in there and do. So that was thrilling too.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And it was all the days before, before our cell phone cameras. So I had what I thought was the latest, hottest thing, which was a digital camera. And so I was taking, and you have to prop these books in some giant sort of rubber things to hold them open, and in certain light, you're not allowed to use flash and all this. I mean, it was, everything was new.
It sounds like you went on a real journey yourself, like James did. Yeah.
Loved it. And most of the time I wasn't getting support from anybody. I was doing it because I was totally nuts.
Yeah. I can absolutely understand why. I would say justified, justifiably so, I think.
Yeah.
The consistent interest throughout this time he's working in his missionary work, but also he's getting interested in the Chinese classics. So what do you think drove James Legge to want to undertake such a huge endeavour as translating all these classics?
Well, I think he realized in his time in Malacca that these classics actually helped understand the whole of Chinese culture and history. It was a way of thinking, and it was really important for him and for other mission men to understand this thinking, to really learn about it, know about it, and not regard it as something completely alien, because it had many features that were completely compatible with Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And he just, he was obviously a very talented translator of Greek and Latin. And so he had real skills in learning new languages and making sense of complex ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. What? I can't imagine. Imagine doing all of that outside of a 9-to-5. He was working all day with his parishioners and setting up the schools. And I mean, he talked about getting up at 3 a.m., didn't he?
Yes, that was standard operating procedure. Yeah.
Yeah.
A few years ago, there was a conference in Hong Kong I was invited to give a talk to, and we went to visit the current version of the Yinghua school that he founded. Mm-hmm. It's a magnificent modern school for boys. It embodies all the idealism that he had in setting up the original one.
And that's just, maybe 10% of his legacy. It's just incredible. I mean, we talked a lot about the tragedy that he faced in his life, and I suppose this is really in your wheelhouse. So much brushes with death he had. In 1844, for example, liver disease, hepatitis, 6 weeks of leeching and bleeding. He has to go back to the UK on several occasions in life-threatening situations. What do you think were the behavioural patterns James Legge engaged in that made him so resilient to trauma?
Well, I sort of relied on the Big Five theory of personality in trying to understand him, because, it gives some of the elements of resilience. First of all, I mean, his brain power was wonderful, but he also had true faith in some greater power. And I think that he wasn't passive in just waiting for things to happen. He was very active, but I think he had great faith that whatever he was doing was for some greater good, and that he wanted to keep on doing it. And in terms of one of these Big Five traits, neuroticism, the tendency to respond with quite a lot of emotion to any change in events, he did not have that. The most I could find when I was picking around in all these different life events, on one of his trips back out to China after he'd been to Britain, he was with a couple of other missionaries, including some young fellow, and I think they had testy words quite a bit during that trip. So he might have had a bit of a temper, although that's the only clue I ever had. But he definitely knew what his ideas were, and this young fellow, whoever he was not up to it.
No. Yeah, I agree. Definitely very highly conscientious, probably very low neuroticism, quite quite extroverted, more extroverted than introverted? He seemed to have good people skills.
I think so, because, I was sort of surprised at the end of his stay in Hong Kong when they invited him to be what they called the croupier, presiding over the Robbie Burns celebration, because that person has to tell jokes. Like they're a master of ceremonies who's got to get the crowd all laughing and joking and everything. And if they chose him, it's because they knew he had that aspect to him.
Yeah. That does surprise me, because usually someone so, we could say, bookish, so willing to spend long periods of time by yourself, tends to be more introverted, speaking from experience here. And he has quite an unusual set of, maybe I would expect him to be more introverted than extroverted.
Yeah, but like when I read these court cases where he was testifying, basically supporting the Chinese person's version of events against what the officials were trying to claim, and earning enmity both from Short Read, the paper publisher, and from the English community in general. He must have had such a strong sense of self. Really.
Yeah, that really came through. Yeah, it's just the amount of times that people turned to him, the amount of times that he seemed to have time for it. Someone more introverted would find that exhausting.
That's right.
Yeah, and would want to retreat to their books. He managed to do both somehow. It's incredible. Yeah, absolutely incredible.
Yeah, up at 3 a.m. every day.
Yeah.
You've got 5 hours before anybody bothers you.
Yeah, amazing. What do you think it was that drew him so much, particularly to Confucian literature? Because he did translate very widely the I Ching, but it seemed to me that Confucianism and Confucius was the thing that really he was impressed by the most.
And I think that he recognized the deep roots that spread through Chinese culture, that to really understand Chinese thinking and Chinese behavior, you really had to understand the Confucian writings. So I think, the 13 books were recognized as the classics. And so I guess he realized if he's going to really understand it all.
I can really understand that. I mean, about 10 years ago, when I really first started learning Chinese, I think I put that off for a little while because it felt almost like overwhelming. Oh, crikey, now I've got to learn this in order to really understand the roots. Because there's so much, isn't there? I reckon James Legge would have read the first Analect and really, I think it would have really struck him. This is the first Analect of Confucius. The master said, "He who exercises..." No, that's chapter 2. This is the first one. The master said, "Is it not pleasant to learn with a constant perseverance and application? Is it not delightful to have friends coming from distant quarters? Is he not a man of complete virtue who feels no discomposure, though no men may take note of him?"
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
I feel like he would have read that and thought, here's a man of my own heart. What do you think?
Absolutely wonderful. Yes.
So we haven't even touched upon the God question, but this is something that Legge influenced the Chinese language, as the Chinese concept of the Christian God Shangdi. There was a great intellectual academic battle around that, with some people supporting the concept Shen, and some supporting the concept of Shangdi.
That's right.
Yes, and in the end, James Legge won the day, and that's how the Christian God is referred to in Chinese. What do you think James Legge's role was in that debate, Marilyn?
Well, I think he was right, because he pointed out that Shen actually referred to spirits, and you could have evil spirits as well as good spirits. So it wasn't like an overall good spirit, which Shangdi better represented.
Hmm.
And you know, I think he was quite shocked at the skullduggery of some of the opponents in that argument. You know, undercutting him with the Bible Society of who's going
Yeah.
to print which version and all that. Really, some of those characters were really bad characters.
Yeah,
Those
absolutely. Yeah. The nerve
cheating.
of some of them, eh? They didn't even read Chinese, some of them, and they were claiming to know what it means.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
No, I mean when you read those old issues of the Chinese Recorder, when some of these debates were being published, you realize that his scholarship just sort of outclassed everybody else's, and but they just did skullduggery then behind his back.
Yeah. To this day, they stand up, don't they? These translations of concepts that he has. In 1873, after all he finds out about Confucius and how much he comes to respect his work, he takes a long trip out to the north of China and visits his hometown of Chufu, where Confucius was born. What interested you about that trip, or what do you recall about that trip, Marilyn?
Well, it was kind of fun in a way because, of course, he had to use the local locomotion things. So he and his pal were in these Peking carts, they were called, you know, wooden carts with giant wooden wheels creaking along. And you know, although his whole life had been spent doing sort of literary scholarship, from an early age, he was also interested in science. So he made notes in his letters about the ways of controlling the river water, and where the you know, the water had given out and they had to take carts to get around that section of the river. And he visited Confucius' home, you know, climbed up that mountain. Well, I think he got lifted up in a chair. I think he was lifted.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I
Go
remember.
up to the top, because that was a standard system that they had there. But you know, he was paying homage because he revered the master so much. He was paying homage, but he was also noticing all the things, and he was thinking up systems of dams and whatnot that could be used to manage the flow of the river better. The Yangtze. No, it couldn't have been the Yangtze. It had to be
The Yellow River, the Huanghe. Yeah.
Yeah, the Huanghe, and of course it has that giant canal, the Grand
Canal. Yeah.
connecting it south.
Mm-hmm.
So I was quite amused by that.
It's an amazing trip. It reminded me of his trip he did back when he was in his youth. He, by choice, walked Huntley to Aberdeen, was it, or perhaps, and all the travail. He did that by choice, and he was always making these choices, wasn't he? He didn't need to do this trip to Confucius. It wasn't like he had to do it, and he didn't have to walk from Huntley to Aberdeen. He just chose to do it.
Well, that walk between Huntley and Aberdeen was also interesting early in his life. You know, when he was accepted into basically high school in Aberdeen, and he went there to enter it, they didn't believe he was old enough. And he didn't have any proof of his age, of his birthday, because the Scots Protestants of that era didn't believe in celebrating birthdays and all that kind of thing. So he had to walk 40 miles back to Huntley to get papers from his father to prove that he was old enough to actually attend the school. I guess he was little and scrawny, and they just didn't believe he was old enough.
Amazing.
I tracked down that Baker's book of lessons that he translated into Chinese to teach children, and it's quite a nifty little book. You know, each lesson is like the stars or different things, just simple little essays, and then all the Chinese text to teach the children how it all worked.
That sounds charming.
Yeah. It's a charming book.
I think it's the kind of book our kids need to be reading nowadays in schools. I think James Legge would be, if we were to show him the kind of things the kids are reading now, I think he would be very disappointed. I really do. There's the standard of language and the morals as well. They're just.
I know. we have such a huge range of sort of moral thinking and behavior, from the worst to the most exalted, and we get news of it, of all of it, poured into us every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it's hard for young people to sort of find a path in all that.
Yeah, I can testify to that. I think perhaps for someone of James Legge's generation, they face different challenges for sure. Health was one of them, and I think we're now lulled into a false sense of security. We think, oh, we have medicine and we have these solutions to these so-called problems that make some things easier. At the same time, they make other things very hard. I mean, it's very rare to meet someone of James Legge's caliber now. Particularly for my generation, we've been raised with this. So have, as you said, that breadth of information in front of us, whereas before, for someone like James Legge, James Legge, the information that would have been given to him would have been of a more, I would say, solid character. It seems they didn't really have access to any of this awful stuff that we have.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. Yeah, that's right. And so his worldview was basically that the world was a good place, and our job is to keep it a good place and to make it a better place. And like, I never saw a hint in any of his letters or people's letters about him of anything cruel or sarcastic or mean. I mean, he definitely defended with vigor on the term question, what term to use for God. And he had very good reasons rooted in the Chinese literature about why not to use the term Xin, which referred to spirits,
Yep.
which could be evil spirits as well as good spirits. But he was never nasty.
Mm-hmm.
He was never mean.
Unlike his opponent.
Yeah.
And I think, though, it came across to me like those opponents were almost, in a way, the exception, whereas now it seems like people like that are in the ascendant, because you'll hear about a lot of people now making personal attacks like that, rather than trying to see things objectively like James seemed to. It seems to me like the opponents of James have taken over.
It's a scary thought, but I've been seeing what's going on in some mail lists, horrible exchanges of views about Palestine and Israel right now. Ordinarily calm, decent people are saying awful things to each other in the heat of the current days. Yeah.
So he's led a very long life of missionary work in Hong Kong. He's established schools, he's saved people's lives, he's raised many children, despite the fact that he's experienced a lot of tragedy. And then he moves back to Oxford. There are a few times he goes back and forth, but generally towards his later life, he gets a chair in Oxford, doesn't he? And looking back on his life, Marilyn, what do you think James Legge would consider to be his greatest accomplishment?
Well, I think that it was actually the translation of those books.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, I mean, with all the institutions he participated in creating, like the public education system in Hong Kong and the schools and the churches, like Union Church still exists in Hong Kong. I've been there. Mm-hmm. But I think that his translations he would regard as the core accomplishment of his life. I mean, I was so amused to read some of these letters in Oxford when his position was being proposed. They thought he was going to be some fire-breathing, evangelical that would upset staid proper Anglican Oxford and everything. And he really wasn't that kind of person. He was interested in scholarship and the world of ideas.
Yeah, I agree. I think he would look back on the translations as his main accomplishment. Although I think he would have been very proud. Well, I don't think he would have been proud, actually. That's the wrong word to use. Contented by the fact that he done so much else in education and Hong Kong as well. Yeah. Yeah, the translations, I mean, that's what he poured most of his energy into outside of work. Trying to think, is there anything I've missed? Is there anything I've missed, do you think, Marilyn, from his later life? Of course, there's so much we could say, but do you think there's any other beats that I've missed,
I went
Marilyn?
through my notes. You know, I've got a summary, a 36-page summary. Of the main events.
That's the minimum, isn't it, Marilyn? That's the minimum.
I'd forgotten that. Oh, I'd forgotten that.
Yeah.
It was an extremely eventful life.
Yeah.
With you know, all kinds of physical hardship that we can't even think about, all kinds of emotional drama and so forth, political things, war.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten into that. Yeah.
It's just a totally amazing life. And
yes.
he really had a strong faith, you know. He didn't talk. I read some of the sermons that he wrote, the handwritten sermons, and he talked a lot about providence in these sermons. He didn't talk so much about God and Jesus Christ. He talked about providence. He had physical courage too, like when he was out on this Qing versus rebels battlefield and they were going to decapitate this little child. He just lost his temper and rushed in with his cane. You can't do that, you know, to a child.
Yes. Yeah, the bravery as well. What date do you have him passing away at, Marilyn? I've got 1897 Oxford.
That's it. Yeah, 1897.
1897 in Oxford, and so he really, in many ways, contained that Victorian era. I mean, Queen Victoria passes away just after the 1900s, isn't she? I think, off the top of my head, something like 1905. I'll correct that if I'm wrong.
I think
1901. Right, well done. So he very much encapsulates that whole era, doesn't he?
That's right. And, you know, I mean, we can be very critical of that era from our enlightened modern perspective, but it was an era of tremendous energy and optimism about making the world better and richer and all kinds of things like that. Huge medical advances with Pasteur discovering, you know, there was just all kinds of discoveries that were making the world a very different place.
And I think James Legge is one of the people we need to rediscover if we're going to discover that energy again.
Yeah.
Because I do see that James Legge met China at its, we could say, one of its troughs. And I think that the situation may be the reverse now, where perhaps we have things to learn from China.
Yeah, well, you know, I read the New York Times every morning at my coffee shop, and for the last 5 years, you know, American press has been building up China as the enemy, some kind of enemy, and it's just made me sick at heart. What China is right now is a competitor, a capitalist competitor, and the Americans really don't like that. So, casting China as the enemy, you know, every little encounter that happens, it's the enemy. It's as if they want to have a war, which is insanity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think James Legge would be very annoyed at that. I think he would be, because he would see the tremendous value that we would have to learn from China. It's because we just don't know. So many people just don't know these great translations, and they haven't read these things for themselves.
That's right. And I think the difficulties of the written and spoken language are a key part of that. I mean, I recently saw some little chart, the number of days or hours required to learn different modern languages, including, and Chinese is among the most difficult of all.
Not it seems to James Legge.
No, he was just so focused.
So we've really covered his entire lifespan here. Why do you think it is that James Legge is so little known?
Well, I think there's sort of 4 or 5 main reasons, you know. But after Queen Victoria died and James Legge had died, the world quickly entered into a world war. The Hong Kong question was more or less settled with the Treaty of 1842, so it was no longer China was no longer a hot issue internationally or political for the British. Then with the rise of Marxism and all kinds of ideas against religion being imperialistic and all that sort of thing, and that it is an arcane language to have to learn if you're a foreigner. So there were a number of sort of ideological streams and also world events that I think just pushed all that China stuff totally into the background.
Mm-hmm. And what part do you think it would have to play in just James Legge being a Christian European man? How much, to what extent do you think that's significant?
It probably still is, because there's probably huge amounts of prejudice against that kind of a person just automatically without knowing about him.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a general prejudice, and like my own perspective is I was brought up in a sort of modern Protestant type church, and by the time I was 20 I realized I actually didn't believe. I mean, I thought it was sort of good and I was glad that I'd been part of it, but I didn't actually believe. So I've left that church a lot, for 70 years now. Mm-hmm. And I drifted to, I suppose, leftist ideology, which in some senses preaches some similar ideas about the dignity of all men and stuff like that. So it was sort of a natural shift, I guess, in my thinking. But the world has gone through so many violent changes in the 20th century, and China, until Mao's revolution and until modern China could just be left on the back burner. Mm-hmm. To me, the core is that the traditional classics in China really did focus on being a morally good person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And our current society is absolutely infatuated with people who are rich, not who are morally good. Mm-hmm. Richness has taken over the internet, all these influencers, all these high-tech rich guys who are cheating and stealing and corrupt. And so there really is a loss of morality at the public level in so many places that I'm sure that Legge would be worried about that and realize that China's traditional literature has such a strong note that the morals of people are really crucial.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, agreed, Marilyn. Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. Is there anything you think I've missed, Marilyn? Anything you think I haven't mentioned that you would like to mention?
Not that I can think of, but it's been a real exercise for me to revisit my notes and things like that. It almost seems like my ancient history.
Yes, yeah.
I'm so glad that you reached out to me and that we got to have these conversations. It's just Excellent. Been wonderful.
It's been fantastic, and it's come across like you've just written that book, Marilyn. There's so much that you're telling me, as soon as I ask the question, it's just coming straight out. So Good. It's come across as the opposite of what you're saying, as feeling like ancient history to you. It feels fresh to me, and it feels like there's so much more we could talk about. I do hope these recordings had worked, and I will check them. Fingers crossed they have. Yes. But in any case, if they don't, I'm more than happy to to try it again.
On me again.
Yeah. Excellent.
Anytime.
Excellent. Well, I'm gonna stop the recording now. Thank you very much, Marilyn. Thank you for your time. And if anyone wants to watch this, know more about James Legge, read Marilyn's book. I just had that picture up on the screen. I'll put it up again. It's called James Legge and the Chinese Classics, and a brilliant Scot in the Turmoil of Colonial Hong Kong by Dr. Marilyn Bowman. Thank you very much, Marilyn. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your interview.